Okay, so
Please.
yep. Okay, Mike, you're the host, so
Okay, so
over to you yourself.
Right, so what I'm going to try and do is share the screen, and let's try and add a slideshow for you. Hopefully you'll see in a minute. I'm guessing you can't see anything at the moment.
No.
All right, zoom. Hold on.
Ah, that's something's working.
Good. Right. There we go.
The presentation hasn't come up, Mike.
That hasn't come up. That's boring. Where's that?
I will stop sharing and start again.
Okay, let's stop sharing. That's stopping sharing. And share screen. Try that. Share.
That's it.
Have you got it?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, sorry about that. Took a bit of time. Okay, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much. I'm going to talk about Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, my grandfather, for an hour. I'll try and keep it to an hour. If I talk about.
Sorry, Mike, do you want to just go down to the bottom there and click on slideshow?
Down to the bottom.
Yeah, a bit further over. And then down.
Oh, yes, there's a thing there, isn't there?
That's it.
That's it. How's that?
That's perfect.
Perfect. Okay. So, yes, just say good evening and thank you very much for all attending. I'm going to talk for about an hour on my grandfather, Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, who I think most of you know about, and I think you'll be well aware of, you know, the significant part he played in the Second World War. So I'm not going to try and talk too much about the part he played. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about his family, his personality, his career, or aspects of his career, and possibly maybe lack of recognition he received from the Admiralty when he was alive. He was born on the 20th of June, 1883, and he was born at Hampton Court Palace in a military family. His father, my great-grandfather, was William Alexander Ramsay of the 4th Hussars, and his regiment was billeted at Hampton Court, and that's why my grandfather was born there. I would say that a sort of a very short summary of my grandfather would be a picture of probably a highly ambitious, highly capable, meticulous, but slightly outspoken young man who later in life matures into a far more diplomatic personality without losing any of his determination and detailed focus. And I'll go on to explain as I talk to you why I say that. He had, his family had 5 children. He was the 4th child. There were 2 boys and 2 girls. His eldest brother is a guy called Frank, who ends up joining the Middlesex Regiment and later becomes a general, so he does quite well. Around the end of 1896, so this is 13 years after my grandfather's birth, his father, Lieutenant Colonel W.A. Ramsay, and his regiment, they go off to India. And the reason I mention this is because something rather interesting happens out there, which I believe later helps my grandfather's career. They travel off to India and then on to Bangalore. And I think there is there you go. That's the 4th Hussars. And my grandfather, it's not a great picture, I'm afraid. My grandfather is the man in the middle. He's on the middle row. So there's 3 gentlemen to his right and 3 gentlemen to his left. He's the one in the middle sitting down. And in the following year, in 1897, my great-grandfather gave a certain lieutenant called Winston Spencer Churchill the acting role of adjutant. An adjutant, I believe, is normally a captain, but he gives Churchill that. Now, Churchill, as you're looking at the picture, is the guy on the left in the middle row. It almost looks like there's a bench there and he's sitting on the armrest, and that's Winston Spencer Churchill. And then if I come down another year to the following year, Churchill's now the officer sitting on the floor on the right-hand side. He's on the bottom right there, and that's 1898. That's the following year. And by all accounts, my great-grandfather, so Bertram's father, was not a wealthy man. He'd already got one of his sons into Sandhurst, but his second son was Gerald, and the cost of a cadetship to Sandhurst is about £500 in those days. And we know that Winston Churchill somehow manages to get his son in free of charge. And we know this because in 1899, Winston Churchill writes to his mother, and he says, "Colonel Ramsay's son has been given the cadetship I asked Mr. G. Wyndham for." Well, Mr. G. Wyndham was the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for War and also a cousin of the Duke of Windsor, therefore a cousin of Winston Churchill. So he gets a cadetship, a £500 cadetship for my great-grandfather, free of charge for his second son. So coincidence, but there we are. So although his parents went off to India in 1896, Bertie stayed in England. So from the ages of 12 to the ages of 17, so for 6 years, he never saw his parents. And in 1898, Bertram goes off to Britannia, which is, a fairly soulless, brutal place. And in those days, obviously, it wasn't the academy, the building that it is today. It was an old ship called the Britannia, which was moored to the river there. And in his intake, there were 61 successful candidates. My grandfather passed in number 47, so not a particularly great number. And quite interestingly, the future commander of the Dunkirk evacuation and the future Allied Naval Commander-in-Chief of D-Day nearly didn't make it into the Navy at all because he failed his first medical test. And the reason he failed it is because he somehow strained his heart riding. And the doctors very smartly picked up on this and said they didn't think they'd be able to let him in. However, for some reason, I don't know what the reason was, the test was rerun and either the doctor didn't notice or the second doctor didn't notice or didn't care, and he passed him, so he got in. And that's how he gets into the Royal Navy. There are very few records about my grandfather. All we know is he's cadet number 389. And we also know he's actually lacks in confidence. He's very unconfident as a young boy. He writes to his mother. I haven't seen the letter, but there's a gentleman called Dr. Andrew Gordon who's writing a biography on my grandfather at the moment. And he's written about this letter. And my grandfather writes to his mother, who's in India, and he says, to get it out of your head that I'm going to pass out a mid being a midshipman. So he's convinced he's going to fail the exam. However, he doesn't, and he passes out 46 out of 61. So he passes out at the same state, at the same number that he passed in. And so on the 15th of May, 1899, he reports on board the cruiser Crescent, and that's his first position in the Navy as a midshipman. And we don't know a hell of a lot about him. There isn't much written about him, although his younger sister called Elsie, she wrote later after his death that he was, as a boy, he was a very quiet boy, she said. She said he was very determined. He was always engrossed in anything he was doing. He loved riding, he loved shooting, and he loved every single type of game. So in later life, he played golf, he played polo and all sorts of other sports. He was very good at shooting and country sports. So we don't know very much about him as a little boy. I've got his pass marks for Dartmouth. If he studied there, you'd study French. There would be general study, French, seamanship and conduct. And for French, he gets, there's 3 terms. In the first term, he got satisfactory. Second term, he gets fair. Third term, he gets satisfactory. For French, he gets fair, sat, fair. For seamanship, he gets VG, VG, SAT, so very good in the first 2 terms, and satisfactory seamanship in the third one. But for conduct, he gets VG, 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 so he's obviously a well-behaved chap. But other than that, we know nothing about him really as a young boy. As I say, he's made a midshipman in 1899. He quickly becomes a sub-lieutenant in 1902, so he's rising quite nicely. And by 1904, he's a lieutenant. We do know about him that he had very high standards and he expected the same of others. And he was very angry if other people let the side down. And in 1909, he is the flag lieutenant on HMS Albemarle, which is the flagship of a gentleman called Rear Admiral Sir Colin Keppel. And a ship comes alongside, and the ship that comes alongside is the Queen. Now, the Queen is captained by David Beatty, who later becomes Lord Beatty. And my grandfather notices something about this ship, the Queen, and he makes an extraordinary decision. He decides to signal the Queen, and the signal is 8 words, and it reads, "Queen's signalmen are a disgrace to the fleet." Now, why he thinks he can do that, I don't know. Obviously, David Beatty, the captain of the ship, gets pretty upset. He takes a launch straight over to the Albemarle and demands to see the Admiral. Of course, the Admiral knows absolutely nothing about this, but says, "Apology, I will obviously look into it and deal with it." This story was told about 50 years later by Lord Chatfield, who was the first Sea Lord at the same time. And what he wrote of my grandfather was that he was a very bright young lieutenant of great ability and huge keenness. He was, however, at that age, lacking in tact, which I think is probably quite a soft way of describing what he did. He continues to rise up through that. Clearly doesn't seem to get in his way. By 1912, he's lieutenant commander. And in 1915, he is given his first boat, which is a monitor in the Channel, in the English Channel, so the Straits and the Straits of Dover. And it's a very small boat, but this is his first ship. It's about 54 meters long, about 9.5 meters wide, so not particularly big. And he is in the Dover Patrol for a large part of the First World War. And I think that's very key, because that is a part of the Dover Straits is obviously, and his experience of the Dover Straits become very significant later on in 1940. In 1916, he's promoted to lieutenant, and Chalmers, who was a biographer who wrote a book on him in 1959, wrote that my grandfather was a disciplinarian. His ships were clean, tidy. Punishments were harsh but fair. So that's a little bit about how he ran his ships. In 1917, he becomes captain of the Brook, which is spelt broke, but for some reason pronounced Brook. And unfortunately, he has 2 minor collisions. One during action, he crashes into a block ship over on the other side of the Dover Strait. I can't quite remember where that was. And then in the port of Dover itself, he actually collides with a hospital ship. And his CIC, who is Admiral Keyes, isn't pleased. However, I think it's basically let go. Shortly after this, he is in command of several destroyers, one of which is the Morecambe. And the Morecambe sights a submarine, signals my grandfather. My grandfather tells them to go after it. My grandfather follows at high speed, and there are also 4 or 5 French destroyers with them, also under the command of my grandfather, and he signals them to chase. All these destroyers chase on this submarine. They all drop depth charges, and they think that they've probably done some damage to the submarine because they see oil on the surface. However, fortunately, the submarine wasn't damaged because it turned out to be a British submarine. So there was obviously a court of inquiry, but the court of inquiry attributed no blame to my grandfather at all. However, his commander-in-chief, Admiral Keyes, took a completely different attitude and asked him to come in for an interview, and he hauled him over the coals. He was extremely cross with my grandfather. But my grandfather, instead of just possibly saying, look, I'm terribly sorry, sir, but nobody told us that there were, that there were British submarines operating in the area, he actually blames the Admiralty's staff for not telling him or telling his group that there were British submarines in the area. So he's effectively insulting the admiral. The admiral's very cross with him, and my grandfather's first biographer said that there was a coolness between my grandfather and Keyes for many years after that. So he's sort of gone through and he's managed to sort of upset two rather senior people in a fairly short space of time. So I think this is where he's showing his lack of tact. Anyway, the First World War ends, and in 1919, Lord Jellicoe selects my grandfather to be his flag commander on HMS New Zealand, and this is Jellicoe's year round the world cruise. And the aim of this cruise is to go all around the Dominions to provide support and advice so that they can build up their ports in readiness in case there's another war. And they go to all sorts of places. They stop at all sorts of fantastic parts of the world, and I can't tell you about all of them because there simply isn't time. But one of the places they stop is in India, and they stay with a chap called the Maharaja Scindia, who my grandfather describes as an awfully good chap, and they go shooting tigers. It turns out that Jellicoe must be a pretty good shot because he shoots 3 tigers. My grandfather only shoots 1. And at the Viceregal House, they have a lot of fun. There's a lot of comments in my grandfather's diary about fantastic dinner parties after the guests have gone, and staying up till sort of the small hours of the morning, having a really great time. So I think he was a chap who really he burnt the candle at both ends. He worked hard, but he also played hard. And there's an admiral's wife who was quoted in the 1959 biography, who said, even in those days, it was apparent that he meant to get on. His dedication to the service seemed to be far more intense than any of his contemporaries. He was always full of the joy of life and center of all the fun. He had such an infectious laugh and charm of manner. So I think, although he was very, very serious about what he did, he was great fun to be with. If you had a party, he was one of the guys you'd probably want to invite. I'm then going to slide forward to, if I can, I hope you can see that. In February 1929, he marries my grandmother, who's the lady on the left. She comes from a family called the Mingers, a fairly wealthy family who live in the borders of Scotland. They have 2 children, David, my father, in 1933, and Charles, my uncle, in 1936. Both of them have recently passed away. But my uncle had a very successful military career and ended up as a major general in the Greys, which I think later turned into the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards. All I can say about this marriage, the marriage to Helen Mingers, is a very successful one. Throughout the war, throughout his life, he spends time and every day he seems to, or not every day, but every few days he writes a letter to my grandmother, and they're full of love and longing to be home and how much he's missing her and the children. It seems, from everything that you read, it seems to be a very strong and good marriage. Up until sort of about 1935, my grandfather's career has been fantastic. He's served afloat for 29 years. For 13 of those, he's commanded nearly every type of warship, including a destroyer, 3 cruisers, and a battleship. He studied war at the War College and then at the Imperial Defence College. He's also had practical experience of staff work at sea under 4 different admirals, including, of course, Lord Jellicoe. And in 1935 is a sort of a turning point for him. He is offered a place by an old friend of his. His old friend is a chap called Sir Roger Backhouse, who's just been nominated Commander-in-Chief Home Fleet. And he offers my grandfather a position of Chief of Staff. My grandfather thinks about it now and eventually decides to accept the position in August 1935. And my grandfather starts working for Backhouse, but very quickly realizes that Backhouse is the opposite of what my grandfather thinks the Navy should be about. My grandfather is a modern commander, and he believes in finding really good lieutenants and subordinates, and then delegating to them. Because in war, you can't do it all yourself. You have to delegate, and you have to delegate to people that you trust. But Backhouse seems to be the opposite of that. Backhouse is a centralizer. He wants everything to pass on his desk. He wants to see everything. And so Backhouse wears himself out. And I think at least one occasion between August 35 and December 35, Backhouse does wear himself out completely, ends up having to go home and rest for a couple of weeks. And my grandfather brings up this sort of impossible situation with him and says, look, surely we've got to delegate. Can I please ask you to delegate more to me so I can take some of the load off you? And I think combined we can do a better job. And Backhouse agrees, but never actually does that. And by the 1st of December 1935, so literally just 3 or 4 months after he's taken up this position, my grandfather writes to Backhouse and asks if he can be released. And fortunately, Backhouse agrees that the combination isn't working, and he releases my grandfather, after what was described as a very nice chat. My grandfather goes back to Scotland, but very quickly hears there's lots of rumours in the Navy, particularly at the Admiralty, about the bad behaviour of my grandfather. And I think the accusation is that my grandfather is supposed to have behaved badly to Roger Backhouse. Well, there's no way in which I could know if that was true or not. There's no proof of that. But my grandfather was very, very upset about hearing this news, and he raced back to London. He took the train down to London, and he goes to see Admiral of the Fleet, who at that stage is a guy called Lord Chatfield. Oh, no, he's not. He's Admiral Chatfield. Oh, he's First Sea Lord Chatfield. That's correct. And he speaks to Chatfield, and in the 1959 biography, by all accounts, Chatfield accepts my grandfather's story. And a few days later, Chatfield's naval secretary wrote to my grandfather to say that Roger Backhouse gave you a nice and kind report, extremely fair in every way. His obvious intention was not to prevent you being considered for another job. So it seems that he's got on very well, following the sort of the breakup. Backhouse has been fairly gracious. He's not written a nasty report about him. But I think what has maybe happened is at the Admiralty, my father's maybe got a bad mark, and possibly including that sort of lack of tact in his early career. It's not done him any good. I think many of the other admirals at the time thought that my grandfather should just have stuck it. And there's a letter from one called Fisher, who has written a letter to him. And he says, I've known you for a long time. Your record as a commander and a captain is second to none. However, I do think it only proper. I think you would have been better advised to have actually stayed with Roger Backhouse and to have carried out as he wanted you to perform. So I think there was a feeling in the Admiralty that maybe he'd not behaved pretty as well as he could have done, and I think this counts against him. My grandfather goes back to Boutrick, which I'll try and come down to. There's the house that he lived in with my grandmother. This is the house I was telling you in the Borders, and he spent a happy year there. And in 1937, he is offered a position of senior naval advisor on the Yangtze, which he's just not going to accept. He's now got a couple of children, and he declines it. So he's eventually replaced on the retired list on the 10th of October, 1938. So that is almost exactly 40 years to the date of when he started in the Navy, and it must have been quite a painful end to his naval career. However, Backhouse, shortly after that, Backhouse becomes First Sea Lord himself, and he nominates my grandfather to be flag officer of Dover, which is very fortuitous. And I guess he does that because he knows my grandfather's had a lot of experience of the Strait of Dover in the First World War. But he nominates my grandfather to be in charge of the flag officer in charge of Dover if war should break out. And obviously in 1938, we're just around the corner from the Munich crisis, so it is a possibility. And as we all know, the Munich crisis happens. My grandfather goes to Dover. The Prime Minister, Chamberlain, comes away with a piece of paper, and we've got peace in our time. And so everybody goes home again. My grandfather leaves Dover and goes back to his house in Scotland, Bertram. But on the 12th of January 1939, he's actually then made a vice admiral, but he's on the retired list. In August 39, about 10 days before the outbreak of the Second World War, he is posted back to Dover to set up the offices and the command. There wasn't much there when he got there. And there's some very nice things written about him. And I'll read you one letter from Commander Archibald Day, who wrote of my grandfather on meeting him for the first time in 1939. He said, "My first meeting with Admiral Ramsay was when I joined his staff as a surveyor in September 1939. I remember it vividly because he made me feel that I was the staff officer he needed more than any. Perhaps I then noticed how vital a man he was, so spruce and alert. I was gradually to conceive a tremendous regard for him and for his attitude to his task and life. Indeed, there was affection too. Though he was reserved, as well as a modest man, he gave us surveyors great encouragement." And there's plenty of nice things said about him during that period. My grandfather seems to, I think through his connections, he knows Alan Brooke very well, who later becomes General Alan Brooke and later Commander-in-Chief General Staff. He knows exactly what's going on in France. He probably knows more than the public knows, or more than the press are informing. And he's clearly very, very worried about the situation. Long before the evacuation, the order for the evacuation comes, he is already preparing for the worst. And he's signaled to the Navy ahead of time, and he's asked the Admiralty to collect and organize as many pleasure boats, steamers, coasting vessels, so these are the ones with flat-bottomed ships, and rowing boats for close shore work, because he knows that at some stage we're probably going to be taking soldiers off the beaches. And although he's got huge battleship, destroyers and God knows what, these big ships can't get into the coast. So the idea of the small ships was, and always has been, to take the guys off the beach, ferry them out to the slightly deeper water, unload them, then go back, pick up more guys, and it's a shuttle service. So he's well ahead. He's planning for the evacuation. On the 20th of May, he writes one of his many letters to my grandmother. And the letter sort of reads as this. He says, "It's just a few lines to say that things are getting ever more hectic here, and ever more tasks and responsibilities are being thrust upon me. The situation is really grave, and I just cannot visualize what it will be even in 4 or 5 days' time. There must have been something very wrong with the French Defense Organization to have permitted this frightful breakthrough. It puts the BEF in a terrible position, and I see little prospect of their being able to continue to function." He's writing loads of letters to my grandmother at this time about how worried he is. He gets visited by Churchill, and that's Churchill in the dynamo room at Dover, poring over some document. As we know, Dunkirk was basically a panic. It was a scramble. The order to commence Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk, was received by my grandfather at 7 o'clock on Sunday, the 26th of May. There was no time to get any men off that night. And the government had told the Admiralty, or the Admiralty had told the government, I believe, that the maximum amount of troops that they thought they would be able to save would be about 45,000 troops. However, as we all know today, Operation Dynamo was far more successful than they could ever have hoped. And we didn't save 45,000 men. We ended up saving 338,000 troops over 9 days. And the bulk of all this, the heavy lifting was carried out by the destroyers, the personnel vessels. These were ferries that had been commandeered, minesweepers and other Royal Navy vessels. So the heavy lifting was really done by the big boats. The little boats did the ferrying service. On the first full day of Dunkirk, my grandfather sends a very capable chap called Captain W.G. Tennant over the Channel. He sends him over to France with 12 other officers and 150 men. And the purpose of this is that Tennant and his men and his officers are going to act as the eyes and ears of my grandfather. So they're going to go over onto the beaches, they're going to spread out, they're going to stay in contact, in constant communication, and they're going to tell my grandfather, tell the Dover base, where the troops are, where my grandfather and his command need to send the ships, what type of ships would be best, where not to send the ships, if there's problems, and to keep constantly in touch so they can maximize the few days that they've got to get as many troops off as possible. And it works. It's tremendous. There's a gentleman called Commodore Gandel, and he's one of the people who gets rescued. And I think what I've sort of realized when I read my grandfather's, all the books we've got on my grandfather, the people who worked immediately with him, the other admirals, the other generals, the people on his level really liked him. They found him a thoroughly nice, not just a capable person, but actually a very nice, amusing person. A lot of them call him lovable and funny. Everybody seems to have a huge regard for him and a huge trust. And Commodore Gandel writes, I remember going to his office. His office is my grandfather's office. I remember going to his office in the small hours and found him immaculately dressed, cheerful and fully alive, though I understand that he'd been up all night. Although pallid and slight of frame, he seemed to be quite tireless. So, these 9 nights would have been absolute hell for anybody commanding an operation like this. Fortunately, he has the help of a chap called Vice Admiral James Somerville, who's a friend of his. And Somerville holds fort during the evenings and the nights so that my grandfather can get some sleep. Another general is obviously Alanbrooke, who's a very old friend of his, later Commander-in-Chief General Staff. He is rescued and arrives at Dunkirk together with many of and all of his Second Corps. And the first thing that Alanbrooke does on arriving at Dunkirk, Dover, is to go straight up to the offices of my grandfather, which are actually in tunnels in Dover. They're all open today. You can go and see them. It's a museum. He goes straight up to see my grandfather, to give him the information, his perspective of what's going on in France, and that it's probably the evacuation is probably going to have to last at least another 2 or 3 days. But he wrote this of my grandfather. He said, Alanbrooke writes, I still have the most vivid recollections of the most wonderful relief of finding a man of Ramsay's caliber handling this difficult situation. I know of no other sailor who I would sooner have had responsible for extricating my old corps and the BEF. Providence was indeed kind that we should have known each other so well before this critical interview on which so much depended. So there's another major general who ends up having a massive role in the Second World War, sitting right next to Churchill throughout the war. So once again, there's another person who clearly likes him, but not only likes him, but respects him for his, his brilliance. After 6 days, on Sunday, the 2nd of June, Tennant, who's the gentleman, the officer, the captain he sent over to the shores in France, signals my grandfather. It's a well-known signal, and the signal reads, BEF, evacuated. So nearly the job seems done. They thought that was going to be the last night. Actually, it wasn't. They had to go again. My grandfather had a secretary called Cull, and he wrote, this was sadly after my grandfather died, and people do obviously write nice things after people have died, so I do accept that. But he wrote to my grandfather that he seemed utterly tireless and completely unafraid of the responsibilities thrust upon him. Only near the end did he begin to show the strain a little. I remember him saying to me that there must be one last final lift, but the ships remaining were few, battered, and scarcely fit for service, the men tired and exhausted. Ought he to call on the men for more? Was it fair to them? There was no question that they would not respond. But was it right to risk their remaining strength and courage. My grandfather actually signals the Admiralty, and he says, the men are pretty worn out. He said, do you really want us to go for one more night? And the First Sea Lord says, yes, I'm sorry, but yes, you have to. So my grandfather signals to all of his ships that night, and this is on Monday, the 3rd of June, 1940. He signals, we cannot leave our allies in the lurch. And sorry, the reason they're going back for this last night is to save some of the French soldiers. So the signal to his ships is, we cannot leave our allies in the lurch, and I must call on all officers and men detailed for further evacuation tonight to let the world know that we never let down our ally. And off they went for the last night. The last night they rescued about 26,000 troops. And that last 26,000 troops made up of 338,000. I seem to remember somebody told me, and I think it was at one of my visits to Dover, that they remember that in Dover at that time, at the cinema, before some film or something, my grandfather's image appeared. And all the people in the auditorium stood up and clapped. So I think he'd become very, very well known. He was, quite reported in the newspapers. And I think many people were incredibly grateful that despite the utter humiliation of being surrounded in France, that we had somehow managed to save our army. And saving 338,000 men, I think, is quite a feat, because I looked up how many men we actually had in the British Navy at the end of January 1940. And I think the British Army consisted of 1.1 million. Now, whether that included the Air Force as well, I don't know. But if you save 338,000 of it, it's a big chunk of the army. So he received loads of letters of thanks. The first one is one from Churchill, which is the one on the right, where Churchill congratulates him on his KCB. And in the letter, it's very difficult for you to read, but it reads, the energy and foresight called for in so formidable an undertaking, and the courage required to carry it through in the teeth of the loss gave you the full opportunity to display your qualities. There was another lovely letter from General Viscount Gort, who wrote, we of the BAF can only say thank you, and in doing so, we shall never forget an achievement which will live forever in the annals of the sea. The French Admiralty, Admiral Darlan of the French Admiralty, he wrote and extended a special thanks to Vice Admiral Ramsay. Sir Max Horton is an admiral. He wrote, I have often thought with thankfulness that it was you in charge of Dover. I hope the Admiralty are properly appreciative. Now that's an interesting line, because maybe they already suspected the Admiralty weren't going to be that appreciative. But he said, I hope the Admiralty are properly appreciative. I'm sure the country will be. There's a lovely one from Colonel Bruce, who writes a similar thing. And then his old nemesis, Admiral of the Fleet, Sir Roger Keyes, he writes to my grandfather and he says, the wheels of fortune turned well for you, and I am so glad. Your courage in declining to remain in a false position with Roger Backhouse gave you an opportunity which may not have come your way. And I think what he's saying there is, if my grandfather hadn't left the command of Backhouse in 1935, in December 1935, he may never have gone into a retirement. He could have been posted somewhere else in the world. He might just not have been available for the Dunkirk evacuation in 1940, because he could have been somewhere else. He gets another letter from a chap called Vice Admiral James, who goes, well done indeed, old chap. You will live in history and thousands will bless you. But I think the best letter of all the letters, and there's many more, and probably my favorite, is from a soldier's wife. And she writes this. And she writes, if even you had time, please do not answer this, but I felt I must thank you for rescuing my old boy. So there's some fantastic letters that he received. And it's very clear that the letters are very warm. They respect him. He's a very likable guy, and very, very capable. He was knighted for his services at Dover in 1940. He was given a KCB, although he was left on the retired list. He wasn't made a full admiral. He was left on the retired list. And that's how that ended up. He stayed at Dover for the next couple of years, and this was the time that we were expecting an invasion of from Germany. Not sure how possible that would ever have been, but the British quite rightly made lots of preparations for the defence of southern England. And the general in charge of the defence was none other than General Montgomery. And my grandfather has an awful lot to do with General Montgomery, who he describes as, well, he writes a letter to my grandmother, and he says, "I've had the most invigorating time with the Iron General. He is without doubt a tiger of a man, full of ideas and opinions and fairly stirring everybody up." To get on with Montgomery, I think, is quite a feat, because not many people could. Churchill described Montgomery as in defeat, unbeatable, in victory, unbearable. But during the war, time and time again, as they go into future operations in Husky and in Normandy and D-Day later on, he builds up a fantastic rapport with Montgomery, and they share a mess together. And so he gets up, and I think this is the maturing of my grandfather. The sort of the tactlessness of his sort of early life seems to have gone. He seems to be far more diplomatic. In 1941, obviously at the end of 41, following 7th of December 1941, the Americans come into the war on the side of the British, and the Americans are obviously very fresh. They got lots of money. They're very, very keen to do something. And the first thing they want to do is they want to put an assault across the Channel onto France. And the British, who had been there for quite some time, are very much more cautious and say, well, no, I don't think that's possible. We haven't got the material to do that. So they start looking at other options, options which really the British wish to do, which are, the invasion of North Africa, because that's where the oil is, and all sorts of other strategic objectives. And the Americans eventually agree that, okay, the first invasion will be North Africa. But during this time, my grandfather is called by the Chief of Staff up to London to start to examine some of the practical implications for the various invasions. And they were all called Roundup. I think the French one was called Roundup, and then he started looking at the invasion of North Africa. And my grandfather genuinely thought that this work was just temporary work. He thought he was merely acting in an advisory position. But to his surprise, on the 28th of May, 1942, he was appointed Flag Officer, Expeditionary Force. So all of a sudden, he's being considered for invasions. Obviously, something that he's never had any experience of before, but then, again, probably not many other people have either. And the first operation is Operation Torch, where the senior commander is obviously Eisenhower, who's Supreme Allied Naval Commander-in-Chief. And my grandfather very carefully puts together all the plannings, the landings, and it's the landings of, it's not a huge landing, it's compared to Husky and D-Day, but it's two landings. It's several landings by the Americans and the British on the shores of Algeria and Morocco. And he spends quite a lot of time with Cunningham, who is the commander-in-chief, his superior commander-in-chief in Washington, and they have to agree all the plans with the Americans. And this takes a huge amount of diplomacy, because everybody's got different ideas, so the plans are constantly getting changed and rechanged. And eventually they agree on a final brief, which my grandfather then goes to explain to all of his naval colleagues of what they're expected to do. And there's a Lieutenant Hans Hamilton who wrote, "Admiral Ramsay did not take 15 minutes in speaking to us, but in his conversational, concise, happy, quiet way had conveyed every salient feature of this exciting vision." Although my grandfather is a deputy to Admiral Cunningham, it's fairly clear that my grandfather did all the planning. But the Americans wanted Cunningham to lead the command, because the Americans knew about Cunningham. Cunningham was a very capable, highly successful, as you probably know, admiral who'd done very well in the earlier stages of the war in the Mediterranean. And so, though my grandfather has planned it, Cunningham leads the assault. And I think my grandfather is upset that he's not maybe riding in one of the ships during this invasion. And one of his staff officers writes of him that an abiding impression is his sympathetic and helpful manner, and the loyal way in which he swallowed the decision that Cunningham and not he was to lead the expedition. He was a greater man than was ever publicly realized. Cunningham is a very nice chap, Admiral Cunningham, and he likes my grandfather. They get on very well, they're friends. And he writes to my grandfather at the time, he says, "My dear Bertie, nobody has contributed more to the success of this show than you have, and I hope everybody knows it. All the best, old boy. We all realize the steady hand on the home helm, yours, Andrew." So he gets on very well with his commanders. And then shortly after the successes of Operation Torch, where the Axis forces surrender in about May 1943, the Americans and the British are immediately now looking at the invasion of Sicily. And again, the supreme commander is Eisenhower. And my grandfather is chosen to plan the landings. But this time, not only does he plan the landings, there's two landings. There's a Western task force, which is commanded by the Americans. It's an American admiral called Hewitt. And my grandfather commands the Eastern one, the Eastern Task Force, which is commanded by my grandfather, with 3 rear admirals leading. And so for the first time, not only is he planning an invasion, he's also commanding it in his ship. And the ship he ran that day, I think, was the Antwerp, which is a rather old ship. And this is probably the first very big combined air, sea, and landings assault. It's 150,000 troops, 3,000 ships, 4,000 aircraft, 600 tanks, 1,800 guns. It's an enormous undertaking. And as we all know today, the invasion of Sicily was a success. And within a very short period of time, the Axis forces were expelled from Sicily and they scrambled across the Straits of Medina. One of the things that I think my grandfather was very good at was having to understand, if you're taking the army across on your ships, you have to understand what they need. So when they hit the beach, what's the first thing they need? What machinery do they need? What things do they need to arrive in a month's time, or a week's time, or 2 weeks' time? And he used to spend most of his time with the generals, trying to understand exactly what they needed so that he could make sure that that's what he delivered. There was a Lieutenant Commander Roney, who at the time wrote, "The senior officers of the other services had the greatest respect for his views on their problems. One general emerging from the Admiral's office was heard to remark that man has the best military brain I have ever encountered." And I think that was very telling. That was my grandfather trying to really get inside the heads of the Navy to make sure that what he and his men and his ships were doing was exactly what the Navy wanted. During this time, he's seeing an awful lot of Montgomery. They're planning a lot of this invasion together. My grandfather writes of Monty that Monty is streets ahead of all the other generals in fighting ability. He and I get on famously, as I can tell him home truths in a way that none of his profession could attempt. And occasionally when Montgomery's being a bit of a fool, my grandfather can actually say, "Stop it, behave yourself." And I haven't got enough time to go into a couple of things that happened, but they clearly had a very good working relationship. Both enjoyed each other's company. And during one presentation to a whole load of Army and Navy, Montgomery explains the attack and the plan for the attack and the assault on Sicily. And after he's spoken for however long it was, he then passes over to my grandfather and introduces him not as Admiral Ramsay, but as General Ramsay, which is rather interesting. But he did it on purpose. And the reason he did it is because he believed that my grandfather could fully understand exactly the position that the army needed. Husky is a complete success. The Axis, as I told you, they leave very quickly, and my grandfather goes back to London, but he's still on the retired list. It's quite extraordinary. He's now commanded Operation Dynamo in 1940. He's planned Operation Torch in 1942, and now Operation Husky, but he's still on the retired list, so he's not really getting a hell of a lot of recognition from the Admiralty. I think what must have happened in Torch and probably Husky is that in both of these operations, he will have worked under Eisenhower, and having had two successful operations where he's managed to prove to Eisenhower that he's capable of launching, amphibious landings. That was what I believe was, very key in cementing a very good long-term relationship with Eisenhower, because they then team up again in D-Day. My grandfather goes back to London, and I think one of the first places he goes, for some reason, there's a party at the Dorchester, and Mountbatten, who he's worked with earlier in the war, comes up to my grandfather and whispers in his ear and congratulates him on his future appointment as Allied Naval Commander in Chief of D-Day. My grandfather didn't know. The first Sea Lord at the time was a chap called Admiral Pound, who'd become quite ill, and he was replaced by Andrew Cunningham, who's great friends with my grandfather. And in Admiral Cunningham's diary, he writes, one of the first tasks was to select the Naval Allied Commander in Chief for the invasion. So this is the invasion of France. Admiral Cunningham writes, one name stood out above all others for his ability, his character, and his experience, that of Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay. The Prime Minister cordially accepted the choice. The Americans agreed on the 25th of October 1943, and Admiral Ramsay was appointed Allied Naval Commander-in-Chief, Expeditionary Force, but to serve in the acting rank of Admiral, still on the retired list. The people who joined him was obviously Eisenhower again as the Supreme Allied Commander-in-Chief. Montgomery for D-Day was obviously the Army Commander-in-Chief, and Lee Mallory, who's my grandfather's very old friend, is the Allied Air Commander-in-Chief of D-Day. And Lee Mallory is great friends with my grandfather. It's just complete coincidence. They'd all studied at the Imperial Defence College in the 20s, and so they know each other very well. They all share messes. They get on brilliantly. And I think it's quite a happy family. One of Montgomery's chief of staff is a chap called, and I've always had huge problems pronouncing his name. It's spelt Gingand, but I believe you pronounce it Gangar. But Major General de Gangar wrote in his diaries, or following the war, about Montgomery. He said, no one will imagine that Montgomery always saw eye to eye with the other commanders, but proof that the combination was a success is that together they won victory. Of the top commanders of the other services, I think he got on best with that lovable little sailor, Admiral Ramsay, and with Air Chief Lee Mallory. So I think it's quite a happy team. They seem to work quite well. The planning for D-Day is just like the planning for Husky and Torch. The Americans have got certain ideas, the British have got other ideas, and between them all, they really need to sort of put it all together. And what is given to I suppose the difference between obviously D-Day and Husky, and certainly Operation Torch, is the sheer scale of the operation. On the 6th of June, 1944, my grandfather has 6,833 ships under his control. The only way you can manage that is through delegations. So he's been absolutely right from day one. Delegation is absolutely key. I mean, on D-Day, on the day of D-Day, the navies under the command of my grandfather delivered 132,000 troops to the shores in day one. By the end of June, so this is the 30th of June, 1944, so about 3 weeks later, the Royal Navy had landed, well, no, the Allied navies had landed 850,000 men, 148 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of stores. Now, you only do that through tremendous delegation and organization and control. And by the end of the Battle of Normandy, those figures had risen to 2 million men, 400,000 vehicles, and 3 million tons of stores. And bearing in mind that all of this is being landed at Arromanches, on just one of the Mulberry harbors, as you might know, and I'm sure you do. There were two Mulberry harbors. There was one in the American sector and one in the British sector being the one at Arromanches. But in the storms of 20th and 21st of June 1944, the American one, which hadn't been properly chained to the ground, was destroyed. It was twisted and unusable. The British Royal Engineers managed to fix the British Mulberry and got it back running again. But all the way through until sort of the end of August, this huge amount of stores are all going through this temporary port. And of course, as your army advances further and further into territory that they're trying to retake, they're getting further and further away from the port. Those supply lines, those logistical lines, are getting longer and longer and more dangerous. So the truck drivers are exhausted and they're crashing. There's loads of material was just being crashed because the poor people driving the trucks were just not getting any rest. And my grandfather, throughout the whole of the second part of 1944, after we've got a shore in France, is trying to make the generals understand that we need a port, and we need a proper port, not this temporary port. The temporary port's been fantastic, but it's past its sell-by date. But obviously the Germans know this, and the Germans are destroying all the ports as they retreat back through the countries that they're being chased out of. However, fortunately, on the I've lost the date here, but on September that year, we managed to take the port of Antwerp, and Antwerp was the second biggest port in Europe at the time. But it takes my grandfather something like 2 months to convince the army that we need to start to use Antwerp. And the reason we can't use it is because the Scheldt River, which runs up to Antwerp, is unusable because it's infested with Germans, and they're well dug in and well armed, and they're there to stop the Allies using the port. And so eventually the army listened to my grandfather, and my grandfather puts forward plans for an invasion of the Scheldt estuary. And by November, the Germans are removed from there, and it then takes 3 weeks of I think it's 150 minesweepers to clear the Scheldt of all the bombs and mines that the Germans have cleverly planted there before we can start using the port of Antwerp. Once we get to the port of Antwerp, then that's fantastic because we can start to take our men further and further in, and we can get better supplies to them. And there's a slide I should have showed you this earlier. That was the planning operation for Husky. It's my grandfather on the right in the white. It's Montgomery on his left, and Gangar is one of the gentlemen on the left. And there's another one there. That's the planning for D-Day. That's my grandfather with Eisenhower outside Southwark House, which is where they were based. That was their last headquarters in England before they moved over to France. And there you can see on the left, you can see Eisenhower seated in the middle with Montgomery to his right, and my grandfather just behind Eisenhower there. And another slide I probably should have showed you at the time, which I forgot. That is inside Southwark House. This is where they planned D-Day. This is just up from Portsmouth. And that is the map room on the left. And that is obviously the invasion map. If any of you have been there, you'll recognize it immediately. And that map is still there. The door to that room was kept securely locked. And the only sort of people who were allowed to go into it actually went into it. And today, the room next to it, they've labeled as the Ramsay room, which is just a room full of some of his possessions such as his sword and other things. And then there's some pictures of him aboard a ship with Eisenhower and Montgomery. And there he is in France with King George and Montgomery. And that's in June 1944. Before D-Day actually took place, my grandfather was invited to 10 Downing Street for a dinner, and other people at the dinner were people like the King, Lee Mallory, General Spatz, Tedder, and by all accounts they had a very nice dinner. And at the end of the dinner, my grandfather asks my grandfather to stay behind. After everybody had left, Churchill said to my grandfather that he'd asked the First Sea Lord and the First Lord to put him back on the active list. Now, this is actually in February 1944, and Churchill had asked them to do that before D-Day took place. And he'd also put my grandfather's name forward to the King. However, what actually turns out, although this conversation happens in February 44, 3 or 4 months before D-Day, my grandfather wasn't actually returned to the active list until 26th of April 1944, which is just 41 days before D-Day. On the following day, on the 27th of April 1944, he was made a full admiral. There was a gentleman who worked with him at Dover called Captain Hale. So he knew my grandfather very, very well. He'd worked with him at Dover during the Dunkirk evacuation, and at this time was working with my grandfather for Neptune, which is obviously the naval part of Operation Overlord, D-Day. And he wrote to my grandfather, he said, "The only time I ever saw him show any sign of emotion was when he heard that he'd been restored to the active list of the Royal Navy. He valued it more than any other honor, and tears came to his eyes." So this guy is a chap who probably knows my grandfather very well. They've been together for 5 years. And he said that was his only show of emotion. Just before they go, I think you'll probably all know the decision that was made to the D-Day was originally, as you all know, planned for the 5th of June, and there was a terrible storm which delayed it until the 6th of June. And I'm sure you all have seen films and other read about this sort of decision. And the decision of which day they're actually going to commit the troops to D-Day is actually ultimately made by Eisenhower. But before he makes it, he goes around the room. He asks my grandfather, Lee Mallory of the Air Force, and Montgomery what their thoughts are given the current weather forecast. And Vice Admiral Harold Hickling, who's then a member of my grandfather's team, he said, when the decision was balanced on a knife, which it was because the weather still wasn't 100% clear, he said, when the decision was balanced on a knife, Bertie was as calm, as possessed, as urbane, which I had to look up, and apparently that means courteous and confident, and as cheerful and amusing as if it had been our daily staff meeting. So my grandfather is described as being totally, totally calm about the plan to go on the 6th of June. Montgomery also agrees that the 6th of June is the day. Lee Mallory says, yes, he can operate under those weather conditions on the 6th. And then the big decision's obviously left to Eisenhower, who after some thought says, yes, we're going. So after the decision is made, Montgomery comes up to my grandfather and he asks my grandfather what he proposed to do. And my grandfather's reply is an interesting reply, because he said, well, the operation has begun. It's too late to stop it now. There is wireless silence, and we can expect no signals. I am therefore going to bed. And I thought that is interesting. It just shows how calm he was. This must be the biggest night of his life. He's got 7,000 ships out there, and 150,000 men, and he's able to go to bed. He's that confident that the planning that they've been planning over the last 6 months is going to work, and he goes to sleep. He also kept a diary in the war, which was published by Hull University in 1994. And on the 6th of June, 1944, the first two words on the day are D-Day. And my grandfather wrote in his diary, "I was called at 0500 and not before, which meant that nothing bad had happened or I should have been called earlier." He said, "The sky was clear, thank God, so that night, day and dawn bombing was going well. Surprise seemed to have been achieved up until the time the paratroops had been dropped at 0200. So very interesting how he managed to go to sleep. He generally seems to have been able to sleep, and somebody had to come and wake him at 5 o'clock. There we are. As I've said before, my grandfather got very concerned that they didn't have a port. They eventually take the port of Antwerp. They eventually clear the Scheldt, but only because my grandfather has to tell the army how important it is. The army eventually do that, and goods start to flow through the port of Antwerp for the first time. Very sadly, I haven't got enough time to go into some time that my grandfather spent at home, which is a shame. But on the 31st of December, 1944, my grandfather wrote his last letter to my grandmother. He writes that I have decided to postpone my leave. He was about to go home, but he writes, "I've decided to postpone my leave and go to Belgium and Holland on Tuesday regarding the defense of the islands north of the Scheldt and of Holland south of the Maas, against which the Germans are concentrating troops. I must persuade the army that the situation demands action, or we prejudice the safety of Antwerp." So he's writing to my grandmother to say, "I won't be coming home. I've got a little bit of business just to finish. I want to make sure that the Scheldt, the port of Antwerp is safe, and the Germans who are just simply too close for comfort are pushed away." He says, he carries on his letter to say, "I've sent my £5 to Monty." Now, he sends £5 to Monty on the 31st of December, 1944, because in January 1944, he'd had a bet with Monty. My grandfather had bet that the war would be over by the 1st of January 1945, and obviously Montgomery's won the bet, so he's putting a £5 note in the post and sending it off to Montgomery. The interesting thing is, if £5 in 1944 is worth about £270 today, so it's a pretty chunky bet. But there we are. He continues his letter and just ends it by saying, "Tons of love, darling, Mag. May 1945 allow us to see so very much more of each other than 1944 did. I'm so awfully grateful for your love and warm feelings, and the way you faced so many difficulties so bravely. My very best 1945 blessings to you." And that is the last letter that he writes to my grandmother. It's very sad. That Tuesday morning, he gets into his aeroplane, which is a Hudson, which he's been flying around Europe in. And he gets into it at 11 o'clock on the 2nd of January, 1945. And sadly, eyewitnesses who saw what happened said that the aeroplane seemed to have great difficulty in getting airborne, and at a height of about 300 feet, whilst turning slightly to the left, the aeroplane dived and smashed into the ground, burst into fire, and everybody on board was tragically killed. Everybody on board, there were 6 people on board, including the pilot and my grandfather, and they were all taken to the cemetery at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which is about a quarter of a mile from the chateau d'Ormont, which was his last HQ. And a few days later, the funeral service was carried out, and amongst the many mourners were General Eisenhower and Admiral Cunningham. So, many of his great friends had come there to say goodbye. Following his death, my grandmother received lots and lots of letters of sympathy, including one from the King George VI and from the Queen. She received a letter from President Roosevelt, as well as many heads of states, the Allied states who'd been on the British side in the Second World War. On the same day, the First Lord of the Admiralty Royal Honourable A.V. Alexander read a very moving tribute to my father, which my grandfather, which I don't have really time to relate today. A couple of very nice people said some nice things about my father. There was a Brigadier Richardson of the 21st Army Group who had known my grandfather at the time of Husky and last saw him at Walcheren. He wrote, "He was loved and respected by so many officers in the 21st Army Group, not least the junior ones, and his youthful appearance was matched by his freshness of mind. The services he rendered to the army will live in history." Speaking of my grandfather, Fleming, he was later became a Rear Admiral himself. He wrote, "One could not have worked for a more considerate or more patient master, calm and unhurried in his duties, friendly and kindly in his personal relations. He welded us into a team, and my service on his staff was one of the greatest pleasures and privileges of my career." And there was a tribute from Eisenhower himself, who wrote of my grandfather, "Admiral Ramsay was a most competent commander of courage, resourcefulness, and tremendous energy. Moreover, all of us knew him to be helpful and companionable." And the last person I'm going to mention is a lady who only passed away a month ago, and she was one of the Ramsay Wrens. So he used a lot of Wrens, which are the Women's Royal Navy Service. And these ladies carried out all sorts of everything from typing to ciphers and running messages and God knows what. And this lady had been with him since Dover. She was known as Fanny Hugel, and she wrote this of my grandfather: "We felt the loss of Admiral Ramsay very deeply. We treated him not only with respect, but with affection, devotion, and total loyalty. It isn't the luck of many people to serve under a real leader, but that is what he was." Well, sadly, Fanny died in September, and I'm going to her funeral. It's on Monday, somewhere in Oxfordshire or Gloucestershire. And she will be sorely remembered because she was somebody who I saw quite a lot of over the years. And the last time I saw her was in 2017 in France at his chateau, where she went to visit his grave, and I saw her there. So look, ladies and gentlemen, I've spent, how long have I spent? Just over an hour of your time. I hope I've given you a bit of an insight into my grandfather's family, a little bit into his career and his personality, and possibly maybe the lack of recognition by the Admiralty in that he was only made a full admiral and put back on the active list 41 days before D-Day. I'll never really know the real truth as to why that was, but it's been a pleasure talking to you all, and I'll leave you just with a picture of the grave of my grandfather at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which is in just to the west of Paris. Okay, James, I'll pass you back
Well
over.
done, Mike. That was excellent. Thank you very much indeed. If you would like to unmute yourselves, please feel free to ask questions to Mike about his grandfather and this fantastic talk. I was absolutely thrilled by that.
Am I allowed to start as the only naval man here, unless there's other naval people present?
That's a deathly harsh. So probably you are the only.
Yes, you are, of course.
No, I'm an ex-Wren.
Oh, good, Karen. Well done.
Yeah, thank you.
And my mum was a Wren too, but she was up in Liverpool in the
wonderful
in the Western Approaches headquarters. Hey, look, can I just say that was quite phenomenal, Mike. I really enjoyed it. I've got to go, but I could have spoken forever about it. Can I just say my reaction was that apart from his charm and leadership, he was clearly a brilliant brain and could apply that to planning. And that slightly contrasts with his results at Dartmouth, both getting in and getting out at the end of it. But he must have had a good brain, neither a late developer or very idle when he was a boy. The other reaction is that he must have had fantastic political antennae as well, because his plans for a torch landing were thoroughly opposed by the American key people, General Marshall and Admiral King, but he managed to smooth the way with a bit of help from Winston Churchill to allow that to happen. And just the other final comment I'd like to make is his ability to delegate seems to be a classic example of mission leadership, which the Army is much better at than the Navy, where you understand what the goal is, and then you delegate, or you make sure everybody understands the goal, and then you delegate down to the lowest possible level how it's done. And despite his naval background, your grandfather must have had that ability to do that, which means trust by the people he delegates to, and trust of him in making a fantastic plan for D-Day and before that for Dunkirk. Phenomenal man. Many thanks indeed.
Thank you very much, Mike.
Oh, there's Karen. Anybody else got some questions for Mike?
I don't have a question. I'd just like to say that I was actually based at Southwark House at MOD when it was HMS Dryad, and of course it's now MOD Southwark. I was based there for a number of years when I was in the Wrens. But I was very fortunate to work with Will and your family on the service at the family seat just outside Coldstream on the 75th anniversary when the memorial was unveiled, the replica of the one down at Dover Castle. So I was very fortunate to be part of that. And just a couple of weeks after that, I was actually down at Dover Castle. I had never having visited before. And yes, your grandfather was an absolutely remarkable man. And very fortunate that Will actually shared some of the recordings of Fanny and your grandfather and chats that had, I think it was BBC programmes perhaps, from back in the day. So yeah, feel very connected.
Well, that's lovely, Karen. So you were actually at Bowtrick for the 75th anniversary.
I was, yes.
Okay.
And sadly, I didn't make it to the museum opening, but we are planning to go down for the 80th anniversary in June. Our Wrens branch in Edinburgh, we have an annual summer outing, so we're planning that will be a visit to the museum and then for lunch somewhere round about, because obviously very special man to us Wrens too.
Lovely, because I think my father talked at that.
He did indeed, yes.
David Ramsay, yes.
And he looks very like your grandfather indeed.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, lovely to meet you, Karen.
And you.
Thank you for your thoughts.
And Will and his mum was also, they came along. We had a service in Mid-Calder Kirk to mark, I think it was about 4 years ago, a D-Day service, and Will and mum very, very kindly came along and joined our service. So yeah.
Well, she's actually going to be there with me at the funeral on Monday of
lovely.
Yeah,
lovely.
I mean, Mary must be, I don't know, well, in her 80s now, so I think it's a bit, it's a decent journey for her from Scotland.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Lovely to meet you, Karen.
Thank you very much. A fantastic talk. Thank you.
Okay.
Maybe also jumping in, can I just say to Mike that I did all my basic officer training at Dryad, my warfare training, and then 3 sets of commanding officer designate courses, all held at Dryad. And I'm afraid the room next to the map room was the bar.
Oh. So the one next to the map room, is that, so today that's the Ramsay room, isn't it? And the
I think it is now, but before we could walk straight from the bar into the map room.
Into the map room. So they
we
must
did very regularly, or go out into the lawn on the south side.
Yeah.
And drink our beer out there. It was the most wonderful, wonderful place.
Yes. So
the Wrens used to beat us up, though. That's the trouble in our training.
Quite right.
Absolutely.
The map room of D-Day was built by 2 people from Waddington's, the game people. And the story is that they were allotted a week and they completed the map in 3 days. And for 4 days, they were totally incommunicado, but were associating with people like Eisenhower and Montgomery, etc. I've got to go now, but I think that the thing that I would really like to say is that the measure of Admiral Ramsay to me is this, that if he was respected and liked by the CIGS, a man probably the greatest soldier in the Second World War, with the exception conceivably of Slim, plus Montgomery, who had no time for Cunningham's replacement in the Mediterranean, namely Harwood. I think it was a bit unfair there, but also Montgomery, all different characters, all hard taskmasters, etc. And to be respected and listened to shows how an incredible character this man was. And aren't we fortunate that we had him? If he had been in command at Gallipoli, who knows what might have happened? That's one of the great things about history. It's what ifs.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Thank
Bobby,
you very much indeed for a lovely talk.
Well, thank you very much, Bobby.
Right, anybody else got some more questions? Joanna or Nick? I don't know whether Ian and Charlie are, Charlie's still there. If there's no more questions, I'll wrap it up. All I can say, Mike, thank you very, very much for an excellent talk. Thoroughly enjoyed it and learned a lot about your grandfather. And I do appreciate you coming on and talking to us. That's excellent. Thank you very much indeed.
Not at all.
Thank you very much. It's been fascinating.
I've loved it as much as you have. So it's been
Joanna, have you got anything to say?
No, I've got nothing. It's just been really interesting, and I love all the personal insights as well, and how proud the whole family must have been, and there must be some regret about having not actually met him. But I guess through all the books and the letters, you'll have had a kind of gained a sense of connection with your grandfather. But always sad to have not actually met him, and how tragic that he died in that way. But absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna.
Great. Okay, Mike. Well, hopefully see you soon.
Lovely.
And B. And again, thank you so much for.
No, not at all. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I've loved this evening. Great to meet everybody.
Thanks very much. Good night.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Mike, you're going to have to make me host again, I'm afraid.
Oh, yeah, right. Make you host. Here we go.
No, cheers for that, Mike.
No, not at all. Not at all. I really enjoyed it, Jamie. Make you host. Do you want to make James host? Yes. You back?
Brill. Good. Great. Well, yeah, as I said, I hope we see each other soon.
Lovely.
That'd be great.
Okay, James. Thanks very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.